It was the summer of 1962, I remember. I was 13 and my father, who was in the Air Force at the time, had just been assigned to his final post in Texas, prior to his impending retirement. Since he would not be stationed there for very long, he decided that the family, me, my mother and my younger sister, would live in Mobile, Alabama, where he planned to retire. It would give us time to get ourselves settled in and also avoid the hassle of another move in 10 months or so. Mobile was special to my parents as they had met there 15 years earlier. They both loved the city and its location near the Gulf of Mexico. It was in Mobile that they decided that they wanted to live when my father left the service. My mother had lived there prior to meeting my father, so she still had friends there. She would not be lonely. My father left for Texas as soon as he saw to it that we had a house to live in and that me and my sister, Mary, who was 2 years my junior, had been enrolled in school. We were in school only for about 2 weeks before summer vacation began. As a consequence, I did not have enough time to establish any new friendships. My own neighborhood had a shortage of kids my age, so I didn't do much more but sit in the living room, watch television most of the time. My mother had a best friend she had known for years, Mrs. Betty Ainsworth. As Betty lived less than a mile away, my mother often would walk to her house to visit. Occasionally, to get us out of the house, she would bring me and my sister along too. Mrs. Ainsworth, a widow, lived with her 19-year-old daughter, Barbara, who worked as an assistant librarian in the local municipal library. Betty had 2 other children, grown sons who no longer lived at home. One was a geologist who worked for a large mining company out west, and the other was a news reporter who worked for a television network news agency in New York City. The only reason that I did not protest about having to walk with my mother to Betty's house is that she did have better television reception than we had at our own place. There were 2 more stations to choose from. I could watch TV and enjoy my greater variety of programs, while my mother and Betty would sit at the kitchen table all afternoon and talk. My sister was no problem. She had a friend that lived in the neighborhood, so she was outside, playing with her. I had the television all to myself. It was a Monday afternoon. I was sitting on the couch in Mrs. Ainsworth's living room, watching an old Western movie on the TV, when Barbara stormed in. Now Barbara was quite an attractive young lady. She was not very tall, only about 5'2" or so, brunette and a stylish dresser. She tended to favor high heels and suits rather than the more casual styles. She looked a bit older than she actually was. I tried not to look directly at her. At my age, I was still shy around attractive girls, and even under normal conditions, Barbara always made me feel somewhat nervous. She was obviously quite angry about something. It was after 3:30 p.m., so she must have just gotten off of work. She walked past me and directly into the kitchen where my mother and Betty were sipping coffee. "Oh, I am so mad!" she exclaimed to her mother. "What's wrong, dear?" her mother replied. "My boss, Miss Hanson. She can be so unreasonable. She wants me to attend that boring librarians' conference in her place Sunday night. I told her I had an important dinner date planned for the evening. All she said was too bad and to cancel the date. She said that if I didn't attend, I would be looking for a new job." "Well," Mrs. Ainsworth answered back, "it looks like you have no choice." "You don't understand, Mother. I have it on good authority that Mike has set this dinner up for something special. He is going to propose to me. Jane, his sister, told me so. There is no way I am going to cancel the date." Betty thought for a moment. "Why don't you get one of your friends to attend the conference meeting in your place?" she suggested. "I thought of that," Barbara replied, "and so did Miss Hanson. Like everyone else, I have to sign in, and Miss Hanson telephoned a lady she knows who works at the municipal conference center. I overheard her tell the lady to make sure that it indeed was me, a cute, short, 19-year-old brunette, who signed in for the meeting and no one else. Is that how she described you? Yes, that should be no problem, Barbara. Don't you have any short brunette friends? There is only Millie and Jane. Millie is 5'9" and blonde, and Jane is going to be double dating with me and Mike at the dinner. There's nothing I can do, moaned Barbara, on the verge of tears. My mother, in an attempt to ease the situation with a small joke, quipped, "Well, we can put Marty in a dress and wig and send him to the meeting. He is about the right size." Both she and Betty laughed at the suggestion. I had overheard the conversation in the next room and yelled back "No way," which got another laugh. I knew she wasn't serious, but felt the urge to comment anyway. Barbara did not appreciate us making light humor of her situation, but after a pause, she looked thoughtfully and replied, "You know, he wouldn't have to do anything very complicated, just sign my name and sit through the lecture." "Seriously?" Betty replied. "Yes, seriously. Nobody knows me at the center. We don't have to look exactly alike. He only has to fit Miss Hanson's general description of me." Barbara looked at my mother. "Would you let him do it for me?" Her question took my mother by surprise. Sure, if it is okay with him, but I know he won't do it. Even if I promise to pay him $20? Now, Barbara, my mother replied, you don't need to be spending your money. Don't worry, Mrs. Wright, I have the money and it will be well worth it to save my job and my social life. Go ahead and ask him, my mother responded. But I don't think you can talk him into doing it. Barbara raised her voice. Marty, she called. Now, I had been listening on the conversation quite intently since it took its latest serious turn. No, I replied quite respectably, but forcefully. But $20 is a lot of money. She was right. Back then, $20 was a lot of money, especially for a 13-year-old kid. But there was no way I was going to dress like a woman, no matter how much money she offered me. Please, she pleaded, but I held my ground. I told you so, my mother laughed. The conversation turned to other subjects, and I resumed watching my movie. Soon, however, Barbara entered the room, sat by me on the couch and tried another approach. Can I ask you something? She began. Honestly, tell me exactly why you won't help me with my problem? I knew that I was expected to say no to the proposition as a simple matter of principle, but the way she asked me the question sort of put me off guard and I had to think about it. It would be too embarrassing, I replied. I could never let Mom see me dressed up like that, and Mary. If Mary even knew that we were discussing such a thing, she would tease me unmercifully. I would never hear the end of it. Well, what if we get your mother to agree not to see you in costume and not to tell Mary anything at all about it? I'm sure that your mother would cooperate as a favor to her friend. My $20 offer still holds too. She was beginning to wear me down. I had to grope for excuses. But I couldn't be seen in public dressed like a girl. People will laugh. I might even get arrested. Nobody will know it's you. Nobody will think, or even suspect, that you are not a woman. I guarantee it. We will do this right. Besides, she continued, if at any time I don't think you will be able to do it, we will pull the plug on this operation then and there and nothing more will be said. Hey, my butt's on the line here too. I won't, I can't let you fail. Please do this for me. Well, I hesitated, okay, but only if you get my mother to swear to agree to the terms. If there is a slip-up, the deal's off." "Oh, I'm so happy." "Thank you," she whined and then kissed me on the cheek. I turned beet red with embarrassment and wiped the red smear of lipstick off my cheek with my hand. Barbara ran back to the kitchen and informed our mothers of my decision. My mother started to laugh, but Barbara quickly cut her off and told her the strict terms of our agreement. I could tell that my mother was disappointed at missing out on some of the fun, but she agreed to the conditions. Holy smokes, I thought, she actually agreed. My last hope for an out had evaporated. Mary would be simply told that Mrs. Ainsworth had hired me to help move some furniture and help paint a room in her house. One problem solved. I was to report back to Barbara's house Wednesday afternoon. We would evaluate my future appearance and, if satisfactory, would move on with the rest of the transformation work. Wednesday? I asked. That's 5 days away from Sunday. It will take a good while to get you properly groomed. Besides, Marty, Barbara replied, it is not just the clothes. You will need all the practice we can give you learning how to walk, sit, talk and otherwise move and act like a young woman. If you can't do that, then people might think you a boy anyway, despite your external appearance. I hope only 5 days is long enough. Her last comments sort of shook what little confidence I still had. This was not going to be as hard as I thought. It was going to be worse. Mom said nothing about the situation as we walked home that evening. To my surprise, she didn't even drop any of her expected kidding remarks. It looked like she was actually going to keep up her end of the bargain. When Wednesday came, Mother told my sister that I would be away from home for a few days, while I helped out moving furniture and painting at the Ainsworths. Mary seemed cool about it and didn't seem to be very concerned or overly curious. That afternoon, I walked to Mrs. Ainsworth's house alone. My knees began to feel weak as I approached the front steps. Barbara must have seen me coming as, before I could knock, she opened the front door and motioned for me to come inside. Barbara told me that her mother was out visiting, so I would not have to worry about being embarrassed in front of her either. This would be, at least for now, something strictly between Barbara and myself. She wasted no time at all. First, she took me to her bedroom and told me to take off my shirt. "Let's see what we have to work with," she commented as she examined my arms and upper torso. Next, she told me to take off my jeans. I hesitated. Barbara, sensing my uneasiness about removing my trousers in front of her, said, "You are wearing undershorts, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied. "So get on with it." She shot back. "It's no different than standing in front of me in your swimming trunks. They cover the same area." I couldn't disagree with her logic, so I slipped of my jeans and stood there in my briefs while she looked me over from head to foot. "You know that we will have to shave your legs," she stated matter-of-factly, "and your arms." She walked around me and stroked between my shoulder blades with the tips of her fingers. "Your back too, and anywhere else you have any unsightly hair." I noticed that the water was running in the bathroom. The tub was filling up as I was submitting to my inspection. Barbara told me to get in the tub and soak for a few minutes, and that she would soon be there to help me with the shaving. "But won't I be naked in the tub?" I whined. "Here, wear this," she said as she threw me a dark blue article of clothing. I recognized it as the bottom part of a woman's two-piece swimming suit. I went into the bathroom and closed the door behind me. I removed my briefs, but was hesitant to put on the woman's swimsuit bottom. I thought about it for a few seconds and then decided to put it on anyway. It was certainly preferable to being naked in the tub when Barbara came in. The stretchy fabric fit me closely, but not excessively tight. I climbed into the tub, which was full of bubbly water that smelled like a flower garden. I had just begun to relax when Barbara walked in holding a razor in one hand and a bottle of some kind of lotion in the other. She wasted no time and went right to work on me. Despite my howls of protest and pain, she shaved every exposed part of my body from the neck down. Some parts she did twice. "Don't worry," she chided me as she handed me a towel. "It will all grow back." She then had me step out of the tub, where she then took a towel and dried the upper part of my body. Now things were getting serious. To my chagrin, I noticed that parts of my now hairless body, especially my shoulders, arms and legs, now looked especially feminine as she dried them off and then smoothed a soothing lotion over the shaved areas. Next, to my horror, she handed me a bra. I remember reading the 34C, whatever that meant, on the tag as I held the garment in my hand, not quite sure what to do with it. Here she said with a slight tone of frustration in her voice, as she snatched it from me and thrust my arms through the straps. She inserted a ball of rolled-up nylons into each cup and then clasped the bra behind my back. Suddenly I had boobs. She handed me a pair of nylon panties, pointed to a short bathrobe hanging on the door and some slide slippers on the floor. She told me to put them on after I took off the suit bottom and finished drying myself. Then I was to report back to her bedroom. A shiver went down my spine and I felt myself starting to have an erection. That could be an embarrassing problem. Fortunately, I was able to exert some of self-control over the situation by reminding myself of the frightening situation I was now facing. Reluctantly, I slipped on the panties. These were the real things. But, however, I was able to get a handle on my emotions by convincing myself that they were not too much unlike my own briefs. The robe was white terry cloth. It didn't look like it would be too bad at first. But when I slipped it on, I discovered that the sleeves were of a length so as to expose my forearms to a most feminine-looking effect. The hem of the robe extended to just above my knees. The shapely bare legs extending from beneath looked like real woman legs. This effect was enhanced even more when I slid on the slippers. The female form of the rest of myself asserted itself when I tied the robe's waistband. My new boobs looked even bigger as they pushed out the front of the garment. Another shiver ran through me once again as I realized that I now actually looked like a woman from the neck down. I apprehensively returned to Barbara's room as instructed. She seemed to like what she saw. "This is going to work," she said triumphantly. "Let's finish up the hair removal and then we can move on to other things," she said as she directed me to lay on the bed. What other hair does she mean? I asked myself. She had already denuded nearly my entire body just a little while ago. I was to find out quickly. She produced a pair of tweezers and began to painfully pluck out my eyebrow hairs one by one. "Don't worry, they'll grow back," she said, repeating her statement of about an hour ago. "Your brows are much too bushy and scraggly. They need to be thinned out and cleaned up a bit." "It's no big deal," she continued, "lots of men have it done all the time too." Those last comments made me feel better, but I could not help but suspect that she might be overdoing it. About a half hour later she was finished. I glanced at myself in her dresser mirror and noticed that I looked oddly different. My thick brows were now gone, replaced by much smaller and perfectly formed wing-shaped arches over each eye. No man I knew ever had his eyebrows plucked like this. This is gonna be hard to hide, I thought, but the damage was already done. I would deal with the problem later. Barbara next produced a bottle of deep red fingernail polish and told me to remove my slippers. Interestingly, my toes kept jerking away, involuntarily, as she approached the nails with the brush. "Hold still," she demanded. "I'm trying," I replied, "but they just do that." She had me lay back down on the bed and close my eyes. Not being able to see what was happening, I was able to keep my feet still enough for her to finish the job. My feet, with their red toenails, looked almost frightening when I first saw them. The effect was not unlike an electric shock. My toes, almost reflexively, kept wanting to curl up. Fortunately, the polish was dry, so no damage was done. Putting the slippers back on calmed me down a bit. "Gosh, get a grip." "It's only nail polish," said Barbara as she shook her head in an amazed response to my reaction. "Now it's time to do your fingernails," Barbara announced. "Let us hope that you can control yourself through this." She sat me down at a card table that was set up in a corner of the room and took a seat across from me. The clipping and filing went well. It wasn't a big deal to me at all. Her next move surprised me though. Instead of getting out the fingernail polish, she grabbed my left index finger and placed the tip of it, nail side up, into a shallow recess cut into a small, slightly rounded, shiny block thing made of metal. She then brushed a thick, clear liquid on the nail and out, beyond it onto the slightly curved surface of the metal. She then sprinkled some white powder on the liquid, which then made it turn milky white. A few seconds later, she had me remove my fingertip from the metal block. To my surprise and fascination, the liquid that had been painted beyond the end of my nail peeled off the block and remained attached to the end of my finger. It was like a long fingernail. And amazingly, was now actually part of my own nail. It was irregularly shaped to be sure, but Barbara then took hold of my finger again, and with a heavy-looking nail file, shaped the projection to a smooth oval point. Wow! I thought as I examined what she had done. The nail that extended about an inch beyond my finger was a natural-looking white and looked absolutely real. It was part of me. I couldn't tell where my own nail ended and the real one began. One by one, each of my nails received the same treatment. I watched in fascination, momentarily forgetting the distress of my feminization. It took Barbara nearly 2 hours to finish. And when she was done, I had a set of 10 talons that would make Count Dracula proud. Unfortunately, Barbara broke the spell and my fascination once again turned to trepidation when she pulled a brush full of bright red fingernail polish down my left pinky. Almost like a reflex, my hand snatched itself away. "Hey!" Barbara hollered, and I did my best to put my hand back on the table. My left pinky had become a woman's finger. It frightened me to look at it. "Close your eyes," Barbara commanded, when my hand involuntarily jumped away from the brush again, "and don't open them until I tell you to." I put my hands back on the table, tightly closed my eyes and steadied myself as I felt the cool liquid being brushed over each of my nails, one by one. Barbara made me keep my eyes closed until she was sure that the polish was absolutely dry. I didn't mind. I dreaded what I would see when the time came. I was not disappointed. I nearly jumped out of my chair when I opened my eyes. My hands were woman hands. Perfectly manicured, exquisite woman hands. My fingers stiffened up and spread out so much that they began to hurt. I started to hyperventilate. "Honestly, Marty," remarked Barbara, shaking her head, "it can't be all that bad." I calmed down a bit. My breathing slowly returned to normal and I could feel the tension in my fingers begin to ease up. Whatever it was in my boyish emotional structure that was so adverse to elements of the feminine appeared to be slowly adjusting itself to the new situation. Still, my hands, with the long nails, felt strange. They were hard to ignore even if I wasn't looking at them. I would get a twinge of a shock every time I caught a flash of red when one of my hands moved into my field of vision. "Now that we have got the heavy work of the transformation out of the way," Barbara announced, "the rest will be easy. We won't do a full dress up until tomorrow morning. For now, we just need to make you look a bit more normal in case we have visitors before bedtime." What new horror did she have in store for me next? I was soon to find out. If anyone should see you with your short hair, they will know that you are a boy, said Barbara as she searched through one of her dresser drawers. It's too late today to wear the wig, so you can cover your head with this. She pulled out a frilly, red satin turban and pulled it over my head. None of that. Not yet, she said as I began to walk over the mirror to see what I looked like. Barbara picked up a sheet and covered the dresser mirror. Promise you won't look at yourself until tomorrow morning. I have my reasons. I agreed, but I didn't know why. I was curious. Barbara reached into her closet and pulled out another garment. She kept it balled up, so I couldn't see what it was. I only knew that it was made of red satin. I took off my robe, as she then requested, and held my arms up as instructed as she dropped the garment over my head. It was a long, red satin nightgown with a round, low-cut front and back. It wasn't so low as to expose the bra or any cleavage that I didn't have, but it did show an uncomfortable amount of smooth white skin on my chest, back, and shoulders. The opening was circled all around by a matching ruffle that also served to form a kind of sleeve of sorts over the armholes and hid the bra straps. A slight elastic beneath the bust tended to give the gown a slight empire waist effect. From there, the shimmering folds fell to the floor. The feminizing effect was astounding. Save for the tops of my shoulders that were covered by the ruffle, my arms were nearly entirely bare and looked long and graceful. The fingernails made my arms look even more feminine, if that were actually possible. My legs now began to feel like jelly. I had to sit down on the end of the bed. Barbara took that opportunity to slip some matching high-heel satin slides on my feet. I protested, but she told me that they would keep me from dragging the hem of the gown on the floor. But I then began to worry about how was I going to walk. Over the gown, she had me put on a long red robe or coat that seemed to be made of transparent gauze-like fabric. It made me look even more feminine, but it did take the edge off the disconcerting effects of my bare skin. I didn't feel exposed quite as much. To my surprise, I found that I was able to stand up and even walk, so long as I walked on the balls of my feet, like I was walking tiptoe. The shoes did make me a bit taller, and the extra height did indeed keep the hem of the gown off the floor and reduced the tripping hazard somewhat. Barbara was still not finished with me though. She had me sit down, and then began to enhance what was left of my eyebrows with an eyebrow pencil. We don't need to use any foundation or much makeup just yet, she told me. Just a little bit of eyebrow pencil and some lipstick to help you get into character. Lipstick? I groaned. Yes, you will have to get used to it. You will be wearing it all the time from now on. With that, she picked up a golden tube from atop her vanity and removed the cap. She twisted the bottom, and a satiny, rich red shaft of color with a rounded top slowly rose. She could see that I was very nervous. This could be worse than the nail polish incidents. Thank God she covered the mirrors. Barbara grasped my chin and told me how to hold my mouth. I watched, as well I could, as the lipstick moved in closer and finally made contact with my upper lip. She pressed hard and drew the color several times along the upper rim of my mouth. The lipstick seemed to have a thick flowery smell that I could almost taste. Next, she had me hold my lower lip in a peculiar way and ran the color back and forth along its surface. She had me pucker up and then hold my mouth in a natural position while she dabbed and fussed with the finer details. Finally, she had me bite down on a piece of tissue paper and peeled it off my mouth. It left a lip print that any lady would be proud of. "You're beautiful," exclaimed Barbara. "You will make a wonderful girl." I was petrified. I instinctively rubbed my lips together, and could feel the greasy texture on their surfaces. I couldn't see anything, but I knew that my mouth was now just as red and female-looking as Barbara's own. "Is everything all right, Barbara?" We were both startled by the voice by the bedroom door. Mrs. Ainsworth had arrived home. I sat at the vanity, frozen with fear. She had seen me. She was looking at both of us. "Everything is fine," Mother Barbara answered. "It looks like you found someone to take your place after all," said Mrs. Ainsworth. "So, you didn't have to use Marty." "I'd bet he is relieved." "Mother? Who is your friend?" "I don't think we have met." "Mother, this is Marty." Mrs. Ainsworth's mouth dropped open. Why? You're kidding, right?" "No, it's me, Mrs. Ainsworth." I sheepishly replied. "Marty, you're beautiful. You look real." I didn't know if I felt better or worse after her comments. Sure, if I did indeed look real, there would be less a chance that I could be found out, but at the same time, being considered beautiful to boot only seemed to rub salt into the wounds of my psyche. Barbara explained what she was going to do. She was going to subject me to total immersion in my role. Tomorrow morning my name would also be Barbara Ainsworth. She and her mother would call me that from that point on. Only in situations where there was a chance of confusion as to whom she was addressing, Mrs. Ainsworth could call me Little Barbara. That was the only exception to the rule. Barbara was keeping the mirrors covered as part of the training. When I woke up the next morning, she could then unveil my new feminine persona before my eyes. Tomorrow morning I would experience a sort of rebirth as Barbara. Mrs. Ainsworth had bought home some Chinese food for supper and set it on the table for us. I was famished. Barbara changed into her own nightgown and joined us a few minutes later. She was beautiful. I noticed, however, that except for the maroon color, her gown and robe were very similar to my own in style. I found myself comparing our body parts, at least the ones I could see. My arms and hands looked just as lovely and feminine as hers. When she lifted the gown and flashed a leg, I took a glance at my own. The similarity was very disturbing. I noticed that her lipstick was the same color that I fancied my own to be. She had done that on purpose. She just wanted to tantalize me into imagining how I must look right now. She was sadistically letting me stew in the juices of my own curiosity. We enjoyed the meal, but I found that I had to curl my lips upward to avoid getting lipstick in my food. I couldn't, however, avoid getting the red stuff on my iced tea glass, but neither could Mrs. Ainsworth or Barbara either. It was unnerving to be leaving lipstick stains just like they did. I was going to be a psychological basket case when this was over, and it has not even begun. It was soon bedtime, and Barbara decided that I should sleep in her bed with her. Being a double bed, there was plenty of room, and as we were both fully clothed in our long nightgowns anyway, nothing much was thought about the properness of the situation. Indeed, it was for that reason she made me wear the gown in the first place. When I attended to my personal business before going to bed, I resisted the temptation to look under the towel that Barbara had draped over the bathroom mirror. I had promised her that I wouldn't look at myself until morning, when I then going to become a Barbara too, but I also realized that I was too scared to take a peek anyway. Would the sight of my womanized face cause me to freak out? I didn't want to take that chance. The time would come too soon enough. Before going we went to bed, Barbara told me that women usually remove their makeup and lipstick before retiring, but I was to keep mine on, so that I could wake up with a womanly face when I would first see myself in the mirror as Barbara. Just try not to get your lipstick on the sheets and pillowcases. She insisted. Despite my emotional state, I fell to sleep quickly. I had no dreams, but did wake up several times in the night when Barbara, sleeping on the other side of the bed, shifted position, or when I accidentally poked myself with one of my long fingernails. I awoke to the command, "Get up, Barbara," spoken by Barbara herself as she gently elbowed me in the ribs. "It's time for breakfast." I was still a bit groggy, and momentarily had forgotten where I was, but it all came back to me as I saw the mounds of my breasts rising from my chest and the red fingernailed hand attached to my own arm pushing back the covers. I slipped on the high-heeled slippers and began to follow Barbara out of the bedroom when I passed by the vanity mirror. It had been uncovered, and a very pretty, very startled young woman stared back at me from within the mirror. "Oh gosh," I commented as the woman with her long graceful gown, turbaned head and sexy red lips approached closer. I just stared for a few seconds. I was shy around pretty women, but now I was one of them. I was the kind of woman that would have scarred me to death just to be in close proximity to. But she was me. I found that I could look her right in the eye, and I did. So much for my shyness. I now felt more comfortable sitting next to Barbara at the breakfast table. The mystique about her, which had always made me feel uneasy in her presence, had vanished. My childhood fears about being kissed by a girl and having lipstick marks left on my face, which I think may have been the primary source of my shyness to begin with, had been totally diffused. Hell, I was wearing just as much lipstick as any other girl now. I no longer had to fear a playful kiss, as an effort to embarrass me, by my mother, Barbara, or any other woman. It would now be totally redundant. I felt liberated. We finished breakfast, and Barbara took me back to her room. She now began to explain what the game plan for the next few days was going to be. "The first thing we are going to do today, Barbara," she addressed me, "is to get you dressed up as you will be when you attend the conference meeting. If we can't make you look right to begin with, there will no reason for us to continue with this little charade. But just based on what you look like now, I don't think that we will have any problems. We will dress you a bit more casually and use a little less makeup for your everyday wear if we decide to go ahead." She took some cream and removed my lipstick and eyebrow pencil. I was relieved to see that I came off so easily. I didn't look that much different though. My lips still looked a feminine pink and my brows were still thin and arched like a girl's. We removed the gown and turban and hung them back in her wardrobe. She sent me to the bathroom, still wearing my panties and bra, to go take a bath. I reported back as soon as I was finished, wearing a clean panty and bra. Said I had to get her to hook the bra strap for me though, as my fingernails kept getting in the way and had greatly reduced my manual dexterity. Barbara, meanwhile, had changed into a skirt, high heels and a blouse with puffy long sleeves. She was dressed, now it was my turn. She had me climb into something that looked like a small girdle, but it had oval pads made into it that fitted along the curves of my hips and butt. Next, she wrapped a waist nipper around me, told me to brace myself against a chair, and exhale. She pulled the lacing tighter and tighter. I thought I would be cut in half. "Okay," she said to my relief, as she fastened a hook and took out a tape measure. She wrapped it around my waist and said 23 inches. "That will have to do for now. The fit might be a little tight, but we can get you into the dress." She then pulled a white slip over my head and pulled it down into place. She directed me to sit on the edge of the bed and then she pulled a seamed nylon stocking up my right leg and then did the left. She made me point my toes in a most feminine-looking and distressing manner as she pulled the stocking up to my mid-thighs and clipped on the front garters that hung down from the waist nipper. She stood me up, reached under my slip and attached the garters to the stockings and back. It was hard to stand up. The nylons were so slick that it was like trying to stand on a pair of banana peels. I almost lost my footing as she fastened the last garter. "We will fix that," she said, and directed me to sit on the bed again. I couldn't help noticing how I seemed to look like a woman in her underwear. She brought over a pair of red pumps, with the pointed toes and pencil-thin high heels at least 3 inches high, maybe more, just like I have seen her wear many times. As she tried to fit one onto my foot, however, there was a problem. While they might have been long enough, my own foot was definitely too wide. After a couple of tries, she left the room, had a few words with her mother, and returned with another pair of shoes. "These are Mother's," she said, "let's try them." They were about the same size, but wider, and they did fit, although bit tightly. I was now amazed at how much my legs looked just like a woman's. When I first stood up, I suddenly felt rooted to the spot. It was all I could do to keep from toppling over. How I would walk in these things was beyond my comprehension. I noticed that they forced my body to take on a different posture. My back arched backwards, causing both my butt and boobs to jut outward. I just stood there for some seconds, trying to find my balance and retaining a precarious hold on verticality. "Put your weight on your toes," Barbara suggested as she noticed my difficulties. Yes, it seemed to work. I could walk on tiptoe, who couldn't? I could now stand. It was only a little more difficult than with the lower-heeled slippers. I took a couple of awkward steps and heard the heels click on the hardwood floors. There was obviously a lot for me to learn before I could maintain a steady gait, but things were looking up for me now. Barbara next reached into her closet and pulled out a white blouse. The narrow sleeves were just below elbow length and had ruffled cuffs. A similar ruffle formed the collar and ran down the front. She put me in it and buttoned it up. She had me step into a straight, narrow red skirt, pulled it up to my waist and zipped it up. It hugged the lower curves of my body, like I had been poured into it. A matching red vest, over the blouse, completed my ensemble. I was now dressed entirely like a young woman. A look in the mirror confirmed it. My short hair and lack of makeup looked a bit odd, to be sure, but from the neck down I looked as female and as good as Barbara herself ever did. Barbara now had me sit in the vanity chair, but facing away from the mirror. "Promise you won't look till I finish?" she asked. "Okay," I agreed. She took out a flesh-colored liquid and carefully smeared it all over my face with 2 fingers. "This is to make your face all one color," she explained. After it had dried, she powdered my face all over and applied a brick red powder to my cheeks. I knew what that was for. Again she penciled my eyebrows and then picked up something that looked like a tube of lipstick. The lipstick was an iridescent blue, which puzzled me at first, until she began to color my eyelids with it. She smoothed it out with her fingers, drawing it out somewhat, beyond the outer corners of my eyes. She then picked up a little bottle that had a brush in the cap and told me to hold very still. She brushed the black liquid in a thick line along the edge of my upper eyelids just above the lashes, and artfully curved up the line just beyond the outer corners of each eye. She applied it to the lower lid too, but much more thinly. I wondered what I must look like by now, but I resisted the urge to look in the mirror. Barbara next took a funny-looking brush and began to brush some bluish-black substance onto my eyelashes. I thought she was going to put out my eye with that thing, and she likely would have too, had I not held perfectly still. Slowly I could feel my eyelashes seem to get hard and even seem to make a noise as I blinked my eyes. My lashes grew so long that I could actually see them. It was like looking from out under a pair of awnings. I remember thinking that this could become quite aggravating. Barbara opened a tall round box and pulled out a brown wig. It was styled in a sort of full pageboy style and was just below the collar in length. It was very similar to Barbara's own style and that of most other young women of that era. She placed the wig on my head and, with a thin hook-like tool, began to pull strands of my own hair through holes in the scalp of the wig itself. "What are you doing?" I asked, foolishly thinking that a wig was simply something one put on one's head like a hat. "I'm attaching it to your head," replied Barbara. "You don't want it to fall off." She used small metal clips attached to my own hair and some kind of glue to hold it in place. Then she brushed and combed it as vigorously as if it were my own hair. It even felt like it. It hurt! After she adjusted the bangs and got the hairstyle just right, she reached for the lipstick. It wasn't as scary this time. I did notice, however, that it tasted somewhat different and didn't feel nearly as creamy as it did before. The color was similar, but it was obviously a different brand. Barbara opened her jewelry box, took out a pair of pearl earrings and clipped them to my ears. She slipped a ring on my right ring finger, a bracelet on my right wrist and a lady's watch on my left. Finally, she fastened a simple pearl necklace around my neck. When Barbara told me to turn around, I was dumbfounded by what I saw in the mirror. If my revelation this morning was shocking, this was even more so. I looked exactly like a woman about Barbara's age. I presented the same heavily made up and somewhat overdressed visage that Barbara took on herself when she went to work downtown. It was amazing! My legs, arms, hands, and even our figures looked alike. Being unrelated, we looked different facially, but the makeup was the same style and colors that Barbara used. Indeed, it was her makeup. But I looked just as pretty and just as authentic as Barbara did herself. Yes, I certainly did conform to the description of the short, attractive brunette that Barbara's boss had told her friend to be watching for. My attitude at this time was one of awe rather than fear or embarrassment, and I hardly noticed when Mrs. Ainsworth entered the room to inspect her daughter's handiwork. "She's pretty," she said to Barbara. For some reason the simple comment made me cringe. "And we have nearly 4 whole days for Barbara to practice to get ready for her little 2-hour performance," Barbara answered back excitedly. "This is going to work." All I could do was stand there, looking at the lady in the mirror and dreading what the next 4 days would be like. I was now more concerned about what would happen to me mentally. Surely I would not be the same when this ordeal was over. I already was a different person than I was just yesterday afternoon. So far, so good, however. I was considerably less shy around women now. I could only hope any further changes would be only for the better and that I would not end up becoming some sort of warped pervert. But still, if I got caught, my life would be over. I sure hoped that Barbara was right when she said that this would work. End of part 1. As I stood there that Thursday morning in the summer of 1962, it was all I could do to stare in both awe and astonishment at the attractive, young woman in the mirror. Just yesterday I had been 13-year-old Marty Wright, but now I was, as far as the rest of the world was concerned, 19-year-old Barbara Ainsworth. Sure, I volunteered for this, after a bit of sweet talk and arm twisting on behalf of the real, or at least original Barbara Ainsworth. After all, she was the daughter of my mother's best friend and made me feel somewhat obligated to help her out. An inducement of $20, which was a lot of money to a kid back then, served as the inducement that finalized the deal. Barbara had a problem. She had a big date planned for Sunday night with her boyfriend. She had gotten word from his sister that he was, perhaps, going to propose to her. Unfortunately, Miss Hanson, Barbara's boss, the head librarian at the Mobile Municipal Library, where Barbara worked as an assistant, had insisted that Barbara attend a lecture at the librarians' conference on that same night. Yes, Barbara had thought of sending a friend in her place to sign in for her and take a few notes, but Miss Hanson complicated things further. Barbara overheard her telephone conversation with an associate who would be managing the sign-in sheets at the conference. Hansen told her to make sure that it was a short, attractive brunette who signed in, and not anyone else. Unfortunately, none of Barbara's friends, at least the ones who were available, matched that general description or could be made to match it. Barbara was desperate. My mother jokingly suggested that she use me, but failed to realize just how desperate Barbara actually was. Of course I refused, initially, but after a bit of cajoling and an offer of $20, I agreed to do it, provided that my mother, though knowing of the arrangement, would not be permitted to see me in such a humiliating condition. And my younger sister was not to know at all. I would never hear the end of her teasing if this ever got out. To my surprise, my mother agreed to the deal. I had to go through with it. According to Barbara, all I would have to do was to let her disguise me to fit the general description of herself given by Miss Hansen, sign in and attend the lecture in her place. I would only have to sit in the hall for a couple of hours and leave. Of course, in reality, things cannot be all that simple. Although the lecture was not until Sunday, Barbara insisted that I report to her house the Wednesday afternoon before. That would give her time to do a complete makeover on me, just to see if I could look the part well enough to pull it off. There would be no sense in even trying if I couldn't pass for a 19-year-old woman. If the first part was successful, the remaining days would be devoted to what she called total immersion training, where I would be taught how to walk, talk, sit and otherwise move and act like a woman. Looking like a woman was not enough. I had to also be able to play the part. If I couldn't do this, both Barbara and myself would be in big trouble. It took her all afternoon Wednesday to shave, pluck, manicure and pedicure my body, just to get it ready for the first test. Before I went to bed that night, I was dressed in a long satin nightgown and lipstick, so that I would wake up in my new persona, Barbara, which I would be called during my training. Barbara's mother could also call me Little Barbara if she had to distinguish between us in conversation. Those would be the only names that I would answer to, besides, of course, Miss Ainsworth. Well, I awoke as Barbara the next day, and after breakfast, my namesake took me to her room and proceeded to dress me in the outfit I would be wearing to the lecture. Over the padding and corset try, I was dressed in a frilly white blouse, a straight red skirt and vest, red, pointy-toe high heels, a brunette wig and the full complement of makeup. I didn't resemble Barbara facially, as we were not related, but I sure did look like the short, attractive brunette that Miss Hansen's associate would be watching for. As I was wearing Barbara's clothes and makeup too, any verbal description of me that might be transmitted back to Miss Hansen would only serve to reinforce the implication that Barbara did indeed attend the lecture. So we decided that I at least looked the part. Now the really hard stuff would begin. I hadn't anticipated having to live like this for almost 4 days. That $20 was not looking like nearly enough compensation for my trouble, but a deal was a deal. I stood there looking in the mirror, desperately trying to make myself believe that that is what I actually looked like now. It was difficult to make my mind believe what my eyes were seeing. "Okay, let's get this stuff off of you now," said Barbara as she broke the spell. She began to unbutton my blouse. "What?" I replied in surprise. "I've only been dressed for a few minutes. That was just to see what you will look like in this outfit Sunday night," said Barbara, as she continued to remove my outer garments and put them back up on hangers. "We don't want it to get dirty before then, now do we? Besides," she continued, "it's a bit too dressy for going to the grocery store." "Grocery store?" "Yes, we need to get a few things, bread, milk." "You are going to come along?" "You're kidding, right?" I said, knowing full well that she wasn't. "I can't go out looking like this." "I know that," replied Barbara. I felt better for a second. "Not in your underwear anyway. You need to put on a dress." I stopped feeling better. "You knew that you would have to go outside eventually." How could you attend the lecture otherwise? Barbara continued. You have to get used to being outside in public, and now is just as good as any time to start. She was right. I knew that I would have to go out eventually. I had resolved to deal with it when the time came, but I didn't think it would be this soon. Hey, I protested, you haven't taught me how to walk, talk, sit, or any of those other things you told me I have to know how to do. The store is 5 blocks away. She responded, by the time we get there you will have already learned how to walk. You don't have to worry about sitting down because you will be pushing the grocery cart, and as far as speaking goes, just keep your mouth shut. I could tell that I wouldn't be able to weasel my out of this one. Barbara exchanged my red high heels for a pair of less flashy tan ones. As they had the same high, pencil-thin heels, learning to walk in them would be no less of a challenge. Next, she pulled a beige, sleeveless, wide-necked dress over my slip. The skirt, a bit looser than what I had on previously, fell to my knees. When she zipped it up, the garment fit tightly along the upper curves of my hips and emphasized my narrow corseted waist. Barbara was right, I didn't look as dressy now, but I didn't look any less like a girl either. I would fit right in with most of the other ladies shopping for groceries. Shall we go? Said Barbara as she thrust a purse in my hand, grasped my wrist and practically dragged me to the front door. I was terrified. My legs felt like jelly. I stopped for a second to catch my breath and take a quick reassuring glance at myself in the hall mirror. Then, mustering up all of my courage, I took my first step out of the door. Now that wasn't so bad now, was it? Said Barbara as we stood on the stoop. I saw several people on the sidewalk, here and there, as we proceeded down the front yard path. But to my surprise, they seemed to take little or no notice of us. Sure, a man, and even a woman or two, might have glanced at us for a second or so, but that's all it was. They just continued on their way. I received none of the open-mouthed gawking and stares that I had expected. Indeed, I got a lot fewer looks than I expected to get if I actually had been a real woman. There was nothing like the pressure of being seen in public to force me to remember every detail of what I had learned from Barbara, so far, in walking in heels. Occasionally she would whisper a tip or two to me, such as take smaller steps, pull your shoulders back and the like. I followed to the letter her every word. By the time we were halfway there, I started to feel a little more confident. I had gotten into the rhythm of things. I also didn't feel quite as afraid of the people anymore. For all practical purposes, I felt almost invisible. Indeed, I found that I could look passers-by in the face, and they would either avert their eyes or actually turn away. I now began to feel some confidence in the disguise. I didn't feel like I looked like some kind of half-boy, half-girl freak anymore. So long as I was careful and behaved as I was told, my secret could be safe. At the grocery store, I followed Barbara around as she filled her shopping basket with the few items we came for. The store owner, Mr. Beasley, checked the items at the counter. "Hello, Miss Ainsworth," he said. "Did you find everything you needed?" "Yes, thanks, Mr. Beasley," Barbara replied. "And this is my cousin, Mary, visiting me and Mother from Tennessee." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Mary," Mr. Beasley replied. My hair stood on the back of my neck. I was frightened. What was I going to do? Barbara had told me to keep my mouth shut. So that's what I did. I managed a closed-mouth smile and nodded my head in greeting and quickly made tracks out of there with Barbara. "Now that wasn't too bad, was it?" said Barbara as we were out of earshot of the store and back on the sidewalk. "Why did you do that?" I angrily asked her. I almost had to talk. "I knew Mr. Beasley would ask you who you were, so I introduced you first," Barbara replied. "That way I got to say your name and you didn't have to say anything." You handled that real well. My feet and the backs of my legs really hurt by the time we got home. I flopped into a big chair, slipped the heels off and massaged my toes through my stockings as I waited for Mrs. Ainsworth to finish preparing lunch. Barbara brought me a set of tan flats to wear for a while, to rest my feet and give me a little traction so I would not slip on the floor with my nylon-clad feet. At lunch I noticed something odd. My lips did not leave the red marks on the glass as they did at supper and breakfast. My reflection in the spoon, however, told me that my mouth was as red as it had ever been. My lipstick had not wore off by any means. I asked Barbara why I had not left any marks on the glass. When we dressed you up this morning, I used some kiss-proof lipstick on you. That way we won't have to be fixing up your lips every 10 minutes. Yes, that explained the different taste I noticed when she applied it. I also noticed that it felt somewhat drier and not as greasy as what she had applied to me last night. But then I thought about it. Kiss-proof? How do I get it off? I asked nervously. Don't worry about it, Barbara replied. You don't need to get it off. You can't take it off anyway, it has to wear off. You mean it's permanent? I shouted, as horrific visions of having to go home and be seen, with bright red lips, flitted through my head. By no means. It's only good for just about 24 hours, then it needs to be touched up again. This way, Barbara continued, you won't have to learn to apply lipstick to yourself, you won't have to worry about accidentally smearing it on your clothes, and you will look pretty all day long and even all night. It's a lot less trouble, trust me. I had to agree. But I was still bothered by it. Yes, it might need to be touched up after 24 hours or so, but how long would it take to completely wear off? Even the slight trace remaining on my mouth when I got home would provoke merciless teasing from my sister. I sure hoped that Barbara had allowed for this when she planned this scheme. I walked up to the mirror and looked the young woman there in the face once again. As an experiment, I took my finger and rubbed it along my lower lip. My lip looked just as red and nothing at all got on my finger. I rubbed harder, still nothing. It was as if my mouth was naturally colored that way. It was hard to think that such a thing was possible. But I was stuck like this for the time being, so I had to accept and live with it. We put the high heels back on me. I needed as much practice as I could get, but now Barbara had training of another sort for me. She told me to sit at her desk. I complied, also remembering how to smooth my skirt and keep my knees together. I could see that my actions had pleased her. But that was not the point of this exercise. She showed me a copy of her signature, Barbara A. Ainsworth, and handed me a pen and several sheets of paper. You are going to have to sign in at the meeting. She told me. I want you to practice signing our name until you can make it look exactly like that. And then you will learn to sign it without looking at the original at all. That didn't seem like too formidable a task. Not at first anyway. Of course I would have to practice. When I picked up the pen, I immediately noticed a problem. My fingernails were in the way. I couldn't hold the pen in my normal writing position. Barbara was quick to take notice of my difficulty and showed me how to hold the pen by curling my index finger around it in what looked and felt like an awkward way. Now it was hard enough to write normally, much less copy a strange signature. This was going to take a lot of time to learn. Except for a few breaks to watch television, so I wouldn't be bored out of my skull, I spent the rest of the day practicing Barbara's signature. I must have filled almost 100 pages with line after line. I also was required to sit properly as I did this. That meant knees together. It was something else that I had to remember when I was concentrating on the writing. My hand was beginning to cramp by supper time. By now, I was doing a fair job. The signatures were looking quite close. Thank goodness Barbara told me that I could quit for the day. The way my hand was feeling, having to write in that awkward position would soon cause me to lose what progress I had made unless I quit now. Before eating supper, Barbara had me change my clothes to a more normal and comfortable style. She had me take off the nylons and high heels and replace them with another pair of pointy-toed flats. The dress was replaced by a pair of white shorts, about mid-thigh length, and a pink knit top. Now I looked like the typical 19-year-old young woman, at home in casual dress. The outfit, save for the colors, looked very similar to what Barbara was wearing. There's no sense in wearing a skirt and high heels, this time of day, she commented. It was not less comfortable, however. I still had to wear the corset, bra and padded panties, under the clothes, to keep my shape. After supper, we dressed for bed. I wore the same red satin nightgown I wore the previous evening. Thankfully, I only had to wear breast padding under it. The way it hung from its empire-style waist loosely covered my midsection so that I did not need the corset. Barbara instructed me in how to cream my face and remove the day's makeup. It worked! I was surprised at how easily it came off. The lipstick, however, remained, as Barbara said it would. It was sort of scary and comforting at the same time. Scary in the sense that it seemed an unremovable part of me that bound me into femininity, but comforting in the fact that it formed part of a mask that disguised my face and helped make me unrecognizable. The next morning I could see what Barbara had meant. If I looked closely, I could see that some of the outer edges of my red lips were starting to wear a bit uneven and ragged. Barbara wasted no time fixing them for me though, with a new application. I worried about how this would affect the rest of my mouth though. The lipstick, for the most part, was still intact, and now I was getting a second coat. Would I ever get it off? Barbara had to work today, so I was going to be stuck at home with Mrs. Ainsworth. It didn't worry me though. I would much rather stay indoors than go out in public like I looked now anyway. My dress for the day would not be very elaborate. A simple, blue shift dress, with the bra underneath of course, comprised the bulk of my costume. Thankfully, I did not have to wear the corset with this either, but she made me wear the high heels though. A touch of eyebrow pencil, and the deep red lipstick I was wearing would be sufficient to keep me in character for the day. Mrs. Ainsworth was no less a harsh taskmaster than her daughter was though. Although I was pretty much left to my own devices to keep me occupied, reading, watching television, and the like, Mrs. Ainsworth was very good at reminding me to walk properly, keep my legs together and to hold my arms and wrists correctly. By the time Barbara returned home from work that afternoon, she commented that she could see a noticeable improvement in how I carried myself from yesterday. "You will make a good woman," she said with a smile. That night I wore a different gown to bed, off-white with a fuller cut. Again, I didn't have to wear the corset. I noticed that my lips were as full and red as they had been this morning. Barbara could take her lipstick off. I couldn't. I started to worry about this situation even more. The next morning, Saturday, I was back in the corset so that I would look normal in the yellow blouse and red shorts outfit that Barbara had put me in. She wanted me to look a bit casual and not overdressed. Her friend, Millie, was coming over to visit. I was nervous. Could I fool Barbara's friend? She sensed my unease. "Don't worry, remember your lessons, and you will be just fine. Use your normal speaking voice, it is in the female range. Don't be overly shy." Millie arrived soon thereafter. She was dressed similarly to myself and Barbara. Despite being her best friend, I could see why she couldn't be Barbara's double for the lecture. She was a blue-eyed blonde and noticeably taller. Again, Barbara introduced me as her cousin, Mary. We exchanged a few friendly words, and to my relief, I got away with it. She turned back to Barbara and asked if she still planned to go on the big date with Mike, Sunday. Yes. Barbara replied excitedly. But what are you going to do about the lecture? Millie asked. Mississippi Hanson will fire you if she finds out you didn't go. Mary here has agreed to take my place. But she doesn't look like you. How? No one who knows me will be there. All they know is that Barbara Ainsworth is a short, attractive brunette. That's what Mississippi Hanson told her friend who is working the doors. Mary certainly fits the bill, now doesn't she? She's perfect. Millie replied with a giggle. So what are we going to do today? Barbara asked as I sat nervously, wondering what kind of ordeal I would have to go through today. I thought we could spend the day at the beach, just us girls. Millie replied. Get some sun and unwind a bit. Barbara had to think about it. She looked at me for a few seconds, then turned to Millie. Okay, let's do it, she said. I figured that I would be wearing the shorts and top, but to my surprise that was not to be. Mary needs a swimming suit, said Barbara. She can wear an old one of mine. Is that all right, Mary? Yes. I blurted without thinking what I was saying. She signaled me with her finger to follow her into her room. When I got there, Barbara was holding a green swimming suit and held it out in front of me. This should fit, she said. You're joking, right? I commented incredulously as I looked at the garment. It was a one-piece elastic, strapless model with a kind of wrap-around bottom. I couldn't wear that. By now I was sure that I could pass for a girl in public, so long as I wore enough clothes to camouflage my body and the padding beneath, but a woman's swimming suit seemed pushing it a bit. We will try it anyway, said Barbara. I had to strip down to my panties and corset. Barbara turned her back, to make me feel more comfortable while I removed the panties and slipped the suit on up to my waist. Gosh! I thought, as I looked down at my long, smooth-shaven legs extending out of the leg holes of the suit. They looked like real girls' legs. Barbara helped me pull the tight garment up the rest of the way, put some padding in the built-in bra and zipped the suit up in the back. A bit of flesh pushed out by the corset and padding peeked above either cup on my chest, giving a very good impression of the tops of real breasts and about an inch of cleavage. I looked at my smooth bare arms and shoulders and shuddered. They looked so feminine it was beginning to frighten me. Barbara had a light green, rubber bathing cap that she stretched over my head and hair. It was entirely covered with overlapping leaf or fish scale-like tabs that made it look like a kind of fashionable hat or short green seaweed wig. I remember seeing a lot of women wear these at the beach and swimming pool. I walked over to the mirror and was shocked. I was now a bathing beauty. The corset had given me the required hourglass shape, which the stretchy suit had further smoothed to perfection. My legs looked as good as any I have seen on any girl. The wraparound bottom of the suit also served to just hide critical areas of my crotch, so there were no embarrassing bulges to be seen there. My acres of bare arms and shoulders combined with my fingernails and facial makeup completed the look. I definitely could hold my own at the beach, and could likely sit in close proximity to Barbara and Millie and not feel like the odd man or woman out. Now this was scary. I could feel my knees getting weak. I started to hyperventilate. Barbara turned me away from the mirror and slipped a terrycloth beach robe over my outfit. I felt somewhat better, but I couldn't get that picture out of my mind. She had me sit down and recover my composure a bit as she and Millie changed into their own swimsuits. A large, floppy straw hat was put on my head and a beach bag, containing a towel and suntan lotion, was hung on my shoulders. We got into Millie's car for the 20-minute ride to the beach at Dauphin Island. Fortunately, there were not very many people there, which was just fine with me. We spread out our blankets in the sand. Barbara and Millie set up an umbrella and removed their robes. Needless to say, they looked quite hot. Reluctantly, I slowly removed my robe also. Millie looked me over. Not in a lustful way, but more like guys are prone to do with each other in mutually exposed situations as compare themselves to each other. I looked as good as she did, and judging by the ever so slight smirk on her face, she likely felt the same way. I removed the floppy hat and sat down on my blanket next to Barbara. She took out a bottle of suntan lotion and began to rub it on my back. She expected me to do the same for her. Nervously, I rubbed the lotion on her smooth back. It was almost too much for me. After all, I was still a normal 13-year-old boy, despite what I looked like. At the same time, Barbara did Millie's back and seemed to think nothing of it. We put the lotion on our own arms and legs, ourselves. I pretty much imitated the girls as they lay down to catch the sun. I posed my body like one or the other. I even turned as they did, when they did. I figured that they knew how much sun they could take this time of the year, so I decided to follow their lead, and hopefully not get burnt. I got to experience being given the eye by the few men who walked by. "Don't be nervous," Barbara reassured me. "It's when they stop looking at you is when you have to worry." Before we left, we got to take a dip in the water for a few minutes to wash off the sand and suntan oil. At least I got to go swimming. I felt a bit overdressed in the girls' swimsuit though. We all had a golden tan when we returned to the car to drive home. I overheard Millie remark to Barbara that Mary seems so shy and uneasy. "Is there anything I should know about her?" Barbara smiled and looked at me, and then turned back to Millie. "That's because she isn't really a girl, she's my mother's friend's 13-year-old son." I was shocked. Barbara gave away my secret. It took Millie a second or two for what she was told to sink in. Screech! Millie almost ran off the road, scaring us all. He pulled off on the shoulder and stopped. "What? You're kidding, right?" Julie exclaimed when she recovered. "It was the only thing we could think of." Barbara replied. "You couldn't double for me, and none of my other friends could either. But she's perfect. If you hadn't told me, I would never have guessed. But you did notice something wrong. That worried me." No, Millie replied. "I never doubted for a second Mary wasn't a girl. She just seemed a bit too shy and uneasy, that's all." Her eyes bugged out as she looked at me. I could feel my face begin to turn red. Incredible, she has breasts and everything. She made me jealous at the beach. This isn't a joke, is it? Marry for now, her name's Barbara, like mine. And it is no joke. Marty, Barbara has to be perfect to pass for me, otherwise the whole thing is off. But she is perfect, Barbara. Perfect enough. She shouldn't be nearly as nervous as she will be wearing a lot more clothing at the lecture meeting. She won't be there for no more than an hour or so either. So she can keep talking to a minimum. Trust me, she can pull it off. She kept referring to me as she. I didn't know how to take that. Later, back at the house, I noticed that Millie joined in the nitpicking. She watched me along with Barbara and contributed to the suggestions of how I should sit, how I should hold my hands, even what words I should use when I spoke. Not that Barbara hadn't done a good job herself in the last couple of days, but a little overtraining couldn't hurt. Tomorrow was the big day. Everything had to work. I could afford no screw-ups or both Barbara and myself would be in a lot of trouble. That night Barbara surprised me by renewing my lipstick before I went to bed. It's good for 24 hours, so it should still be fresh looking tomorrow evening, in time for the lecture. She explained. Doing it now will give it some time to wear off before you go home Monday. I sure hoped that she was right. She put rollers in my wig hair, which was still stuck firmly to my own head. And just to be sure, she renewed the adhesive on the edges. The next morning was a lot like the first day. Once again I was put in the tub wearing the swimsuit bottom. I noticed that the day on the beach had left me with some interesting tan lines from my armpits up. I would have to be careful about going around without a shirt for a while after I got home. Thank God there were no shoulder strap lines, which would be even more embarrassing and harder to explain away. Barbara shaved the stubble that had grown back over the last few days off my body. When she left, I dried off and put the panties back on again. Barbara helped me with the padded panty brief, the bra, and laced me back into the corset. She pulled a slip over my head and helped me as I struggled to pull on the dark brown nylon hose with my long fingernails. Next she had me slip on a white blouse with ruffles on the front and around the cuffs of the snug-fitting elbow-length sleeves. She pulled up a straight knee-length red skirt around my waist and zipped it up the side and topped off the outfit with a matching red vest. She slid the red high-heeled pumps on my feet and directed me to sit at the vanity while she spent not a little time fixing the small chips on my nails. Barbara then started in on my makeup. Foundation was followed by a dusting of powder and rouge. My brows were penciled and she applied a blue-gray shadow to my eyelids. A dark liquid liner was heavily applied around my eyes, including a short slightly up-curved line on the outer corners, giving them a slightly slanted look. She piled on a couple of coats of mascara until I could actually see my own eyelashes without a mirror. I could actually hear them make a crunchy noise every time I blinked. She touched up my lips with a little regular lipstick, to even the line out where the foundation had overlapped a bit here and there. She didn't use much, as my lips were already red from the night before. My hair was taken down out of the rollers and brushed into the bubbly pageboy-looking style that she usually wore. A couple of pearl earrings were clipped on, along with a pearl necklace, a watch and some bracelets, a squirt of perfume, and I was now complete. I would have all day to get used to the outfit. Barbara expected me to perform perfectly as a woman from that point on. I did my best. I was on all day. I sat straight up, knees together, my lower legs slightly crossed and to the side. Hands in my lap. I was determined that I would not slip up. It was the principle of the thing that obsessed me now. I had to prove both to Barbara and myself that I could do it. Any faux pas on my part would be personally embarrassing to me. I became the very image of proper femininity. I tried to remember everything I was taught and even brought into play my own observations of feminine behavior by asking myself how Sophia Loren or some other female celebrity would handle a given situation. I concentrated on my walk. I was conscious of my every movement. When I rose or I sat down, I made sure I was posed just so. Barbara was now concerned that I might be overdoing it. I looked very sophisticated and formal. She convinced me to loosen up at least a little bit, but it much was harder to do than strictly follow the rules. Mrs. Ainsworth was quite impressed with me. As I sat cross-legged in her easy chair while practicing her daughter's signature, she jokingly told Barbara that I should be giving deportment lessons to her. At about 4 p.m, Barbara decided that it was time to get me ready to go. I was in as good a form as I was going to be. She had me change my blouse to a cleaner one, but of an almost identical style. She touched up my makeup one more time, this time covering my lips entirely with the conventional lipstick. I would not have to refresh it, as my lips were the same color underneath, but she liked the more shiny and even texture. She applied a bit more perfume to me, and that was it. I would have to take a bus to the conference center as neither Mrs. Ainsworth or Barbara owned a car. "Don't worry," said Mrs. Ainsworth, "I'll ride with you, at least to the center. But you will have to ride back on your own." "Don't worry, you can do it." Little Barbara got ready for her date after she fixed me up. Soon her friend Mike stopped by to pick her up for their date. Barbara looked fantastic. She was all dressed up for a night on the town. She looked almost as good as me. I was introduced to Mike, with my convenient alternate name of Mary, as one of Mother's friends. We exchanged pleasantries a few minutes before he and Barbara left on their date. I had him completely fooled. Mrs. Ainsworth accompanied me to the bus stop soon afterwards. I checked my red handbag once again just to make sure that I had bus fare home. "I'll let you sit by yourself so I won't embarrass you," Mrs. Ainsworth told me. "But I'll be nearby in case you think you might be getting into trouble." The bus picked us up and we each put in the 25-cent fare. I found an empty window seat near the front and carefully sat down. Mrs. Ainsworth took the seat behind my own. I got very nervous as a young man sat next to me at the next stop, but he behaved himself. He took a couple of looks, but that was about it. He got off not long afterwards. Mrs. Ainsworth and me got off the bus near the conference center, but she stayed behind to catch the next bus back. "Now be careful, Marty, Barbara. You did real well on the bus coming up here. Just do what Barbara told you and everything will go fine." I stiffened my resolve, stood straight and checked myself before going into the center. It was now showtime. I had to be at my best. The first hurdle was coming up. I walked in like I owned the place and was greeted by a lady at the door. My stomach was doing flip-flops. "I'm Barbara Ainsworth, Mobile Public Library System," I said with as much confidence as I could muster. "Yes, I was told to expect you," she replied as she looked me up and down. "Please sign in, Miss Ainsworth." There was a book on a table by the door. I took the pen laying nearby and signed in with Barbara's signature that I had been practicing for the last few days. I was pleased with the result. Another hurdle down. The lady at the table provided me with a name tag that I stuck to my chest. Now what? I followed the signs to the auditorium. Lots of women and a few men were milling about, talking, socializing and eating hors d'oeuvres that were set up on a row of tables across the back of the room. I should have waited until the lecture was about to begin, but now I had to kill several minutes and risk possible exposure if I got into the wrong conversation with the wrong person. I went to the hors d'oeuvre table to find something to eat. I was hungry. I hadn't had any supper. Besides, there would be less chance of someone starting a conversation with me if they saw my mouth was full. I watched several of the other women eat and imitated them. I hadn't practiced eating this kind of food before, and I have never eaten standing on my feet, at least not in costume. I seemed to be doing it right, as I didn't appear to be attracting any unusual attention. I did have to fight my boyish instincts to eat faster. I picked up each morsel one at a time by its toothpick handle and carefully curled my lips out of the way as I brought it to my mouth. Not that I was concerned about messing up my lipstick, a few little canapés were not going to rub that stuff off, but that is how the other women did it. And I was wearing a coating of conventional lipstick on top, which I was not fond about adding to my diet. Soon, however, the inevitable happened. I was approached by an older gentleman, with thick glasses and a beard. He glanced at my name tag and began to speak. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Ainsworth." I am Hiram Lyman of the State Library System. I take it that you are the representative of the mobile system here tonight? Yes, Mr. Lyman. I managed to reply. Mrs. Hanson couldn't make it. She sent me in her place. I'm sure that you will enjoy the lecture tonight, said Mr. Lyman. Mr. Bertram is an excellent speaker and his ideas about modifications to the Dewey Decimal System of classification are quite innovative. Mobile does use the Dewey Decimal System, does it not? Of course, I replied, hoping like anything that I was right. I had to get away from this guy before he asked me something really difficult and exposed myself as a fraud or made something up that could get Barbara or her boss into trouble. Would you please excuse me? I have to go use the powder room, I said with a pleasant smile, hoping not to put him off. He seemed to understand and I walked into the ladies' room, just to indicate to him that I was telling the truth. I really didn't have to go, but I needed to have a closed door between him and me until he moved on. It looked pretty much like the men's room, but with a stall or two where the urinals should be. A few stalls were occupied, but most of the ladies in there were fixing their makeup in the mirrors and touching up their hairdos. I just couldn't stand around doing nothing, so I pretended to be checking out my own appearance in the mirror. Once again a shudder ran through me as I realized how much like a real woman I appeared to be. I thought that I would be used to that by now. If anything, it gave me a needed dose of self-confidence. I pretended that everything was okay, no hair or makeup problems to correct. I did look good. I ventured back into the auditorium when I figured that the coast was clear. I found a seat near the front row and settled in, taking care to watch my posture and to cross my legs. The lecture was boring as Barbara had suggested it would be, but I took a few notes so that Barbara would have something to tell Miss Hanson, so as to convince her that she indeed did attend. It lasted over an hour, and I learned more than enough about the Dewey Decimal System than I ever wished to know. When the applause was over, I wasted no time walking back out to the lobby as fast as my red high heels could carry me. I pleasantly said goodbye to the ladies at the door and proceeded to walk to the nearest bus stop. It was in sight when suddenly I was interrupted by a voice. Barbara. Barbara Ainsworth? I nearly jumped out of my shoes. Nobody, save for the sign-in lady at the door, knew I was supposed to be Barbara. Save for my general description and clothing style, I really didn't look like the real Barbara anyway. No one that knew her would confuse us for one another. Perhaps someone at the conference center read my name tag and wanted to talk to me? I turned to see a rather pleasant, though professional-looking white-haired older woman. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said when she saw my face. "I thought that you were an employee of mine, Barbara Ainsworth. You looked just like her from the back." Employee? I thought to myself. Could she be? I'm Emma Hanson, by the way, director of the South Branch of the Mobile Library System. Holy smokes! I realized it was Barbara's boss. I just dropped by a few minutes ago to see if Barbara had shown up. She is so stubborn, I have to always keep tabs on her. I quickly glanced down to check my name tag. Thank God I had removed it. If she had seen Barbara's name there, it would have all been over. Was she there? I carefully asked, not knowing if the scheme had actually worked. Apparently so, Mrs. Hanson replied. She had signed in and Miss Enid, at the door, told me that she had left just after the lecture. I must have just missed her. Did you see anyone else out here, miss? Yes, I lied. A girl about my size, wearing a red suit, just got into a cab not a minute before you got here. Before she could reply, I saw my bus approaching. Whoops! Gotta go. My bus is here. I told her. Nice talking to you, Miss Hanson. She started to speak again, but I quickly jumped on the bus and dropped my quarter into the fare machine. As luck would have it, all the seats were taken, but a young man stood up and offered me his own place, next to a boy who looked to be about my real age. We said nothing as we rode, but I could see that I was making the kid somewhat uneasy. I could understand that. I was shy around older pretty girls myself once. I finally got off the bus and walked the block or so to Barbara's house. She hadn't arrived home yet, so I had to tell my story to a curious Mrs. Ainsworth. About an hour later, Barbara arrived. She was ecstatic. Mike had indeed proposed to her as his sister hinted that he would. Barbara showed us the ring. It was also our consensus that we had fooled Mrs. Hanson. All seemed right with the world. I was relieved that I could now get out of these girly things and get to be a boy once again. Barbara, however, insisted that I still wear a nightgown to the bed we shared. I was able to take off all of the makeup, for the exception of the lipstick, which after the top coat was removed, did, thankfully, show some signs or wearing away. What would it look like the morning? I wondered. Barbara removed the wig, but made me wear the turban cover over my head, to look normal just in case we had an unexpected visitor. The fingernails would have to be removed later, sometimes in the morning, as it would be somewhat of an involved operation. The next morning I got to wear my own boys' clothes again and my own underwear. No more panties, bras, or skirts, yay. But I still looked like somewhat of a freak with my plucked eyebrows, long red fingernails, and my lips still obviously covered with red lipstick. It looked very worn, to be sure, but still looked like a woman's lips at the end of the day, before she wipes the last traces of her lip coloring off. I continually rubbed my mouth with a white face cloth. I was careful not to rub my lips actually raw though. The little red flakes in the fabric indicated that I was making some progress, perhaps by lunchtime. I was curious to see how Barbara would remove the fingernails. She poured a bottle of some stuff that smelled like acetone into a bowl and had me place the fingertips of my right hand into it. Like magic, the color faded and the nails seemed to melt away. She repeated the process with the left hand and then rubbed some sort of lotion on my fingertips, to keep them from looking so dry. The eyebrows posed yet another problem. Thankfully, they did not look so girly without the eyebrow pencil, but they sure were noticeably thinner than what they had been before. My sister and our curious friends would definitely ask me about it. To my surprise, Barbara yanked a few more hairs out, giving them a more ragged appearance. There, Barbara explained. You can say your eyebrows got burned off when you were helping Mother light the gas oven. The explanation was as good as any. I also had to work at unlearning the female mannerisms that I had acquired the last few days. It felt good and was easy to allow myself to sit with my legs apart, but it took a couple of hours to break the habit of my feminine walk. It was almost noon. I was supposed to be on my way home now, but my lips still bore stubborn traces of the red lipstick. There was no way I could explain this stuff away to my sister, who I am sure would tease me about wearing lipstick for months to come if she saw me this way. Barbara noted my concern and gave my mother a phone call. All right, you can go home now, Marty, Barbara said. Everything is taken care of. With a smile, she handed me my $20. Here, Marty, you earned this. Good job. I walked the several blocks to my home, careful to either press my lips together or hide my mouth behind my hand, so no one would see. Actually, the red was barely noticeable by now, but still could be an object of attention in the home environment. To my horror, I saw my sister sitting on the front porch reading a magazine. Marty's home. She called to her mother and went back to her reading. Oh, Marty, said my mother as she ran out the front door to greet me. I missed you so much. Before I could react, she planted a big red kiss directly on my lips. It had to have left a mark. Aw, Ma. I complained as I wiped the back of my hand across my mouth. A red smear confirmed my suspicion. My sister looked up and grinned. You still missed a few spots. Hey, what happened to your eyebrows? They got burned off when I was helping Mrs. Aceworth light the oven. I replied. Oh, wow. You could have been hurt. She had forgotten all about the lipstick. That's why I like electric stoves, my mother replied. And that settled that. Everything was back to normal again. The lipstick had completely wore off by supper time. I was never quite as shy around girls anymore. My sister Mary never found out what I had been doing for the last 5 days. My pride was intact and I was $20 richer.